The bass line on Lessons in Love, the one that put level 42 on every radio in Britain, was played through an amplifier built by 200 workers in a factory in Maldon, Essex, a market town on the Blackwater estuary, better known for sea salt than for bass guitars. At its peak, Trace Elliot's green-glowing amps stood behind John Entwistle, Mark King, and half the professional bassists on British stages. Then a Nashville Guitar Corporation bought the factory and let the brand go dark. The advertising vanished. In January 2002, 44 people walked out of the building for the last time. Today, the name is printed on someone else's amplifiers, built in Asia to someone else's designs. But a mile up the road, the man they fired is still building bass amps in the same town, and in July 2025, his son's hand-built amplifiers were the wall of sound behind Black Sabbath's final concert. This is the story of a Romford music shop, a sheet metal worker named Mark Goodey, and how a dining room startup outlasted the Nashville empire that swallowed it. Not through one catastrophe, through a helicopter company's cancelled plan, a man's pride in British manufacturing, and a conglomerate that couldn't see what it owned. Chapter 1. The Bass Place. The story begins in a music shop in Romford on the eastern edge of Greater London in 1978. Not a famous shop. Not a shop anyone outside the Essex pub band circuit would have had any reason to visit. A place called the Soundwave Bass Place, run by a former ivory dealer named Fred Friedline, who by all accounts was one of those men the British light industrial world used to produce and has mostly stopped producing. A gentleman, a delegator, a man with a 5-year plan to retire by 55 and the discipline to stick to it. Friedline was not a luthier. He wasn't an engineer. He was a businessman with good taste, a sharp eye for the gap between what musicians needed and what the market was actually providing, and a gift for hiring people cleverer than himself and getting out of their way. He played guitar. He played cricket. Mark Goodey, the man whose name will come to define the second half of this story, would describe him decades later as a pioneer, a gentleman and friend, whose attention to detail was incredible, from playing guitar and his effects for the set list to the team plan in a game of cricket. The precision mattered, not just in sport, in everything. The Soundwave Bass Place sold the usual gear and hired out PA systems to local pub bands. Its logo carried a sine wave trace, a little decorative squiggle on the shop front, the kind of graphic flourish a local designer might knock out over a Friday afternoon. Nobody paid it much attention. It would later name a company that changed what professional bass sounded like. The problem the shop stumbled into solving became obvious in 1979, and it became obvious the way most good product ideas do, not through market research or strategic planning, but through watching customers do something they shouldn't have needed to do. Bass players were plugging into Soundwave's PA hire rigs instead of bass amplifiers. They were doing it because there were no proper bass amplifiers in Britain. Not really. Not ones designed from the ground up for the frequencies a bass guitar actually produces. Consider what a professional bassist's options looked like in 1979. You could buy a Marshall Super Bass or a Hi-Watt DR201, both excellent amplifiers, both voiced for guitar, both pushing 4x12 cabinets, designed for the upper mid-range frequencies of a Les Paul, not the low-end displacement of a precision bass. The speakers couldn't handle it. The voicing was wrong. You were fighting the equipment every night. Or you could import an American rig, an Ampeg SVT, the 700-pound valve monster that had been the American stadium bass standard since 1969, or the Acoustic 360, Jaco Pastorius's weapon of choice, ruinously expensive, impossibly heavy. And when a transformer blew, and transformers blew, you were looking at weeks waiting for parts from New Jersey, because nobody in Britain stocked Ampeg spares. Or you could try HH Electronics, the British solid-state manufacturer, whose bass amps were underpowered and whose reliability was, to use the diplomatic assessment, inconsistent. British bass was a sub-discipline of British guitar. It was an afterthought. Nobody was building a purpose-designed, purpose-voiced, purpose-engineered bass amplification system from scratch. And in 1979, in a music shop in Romford, a small group of people decided they would. The Soundwave staff started assembling MOSFET power amplifiers scaled specifically for bass frequencies, 150 watts, then 250, then 500. They mated them with purpose-designed bass cabinets, the 1048, a 4x10 loaded with 10-inch speakers that could handle the low end without the cone breakup that plagued guitar cabs pressed into bass service, and the 1518, a single 15 that handled the sub-bass fundamentals. Stack the 1048 on top of the 1518, and you had the canonical Trace Elliot rig, tight, articulate 10s delivering the punch and definition, the 15 underneath providing the low-end foundation. It was a completely new product category. Not a loud guitar amp, not a PA repurposed for bass. A bass amplification system designed from first principles for the instrument it was meant to serve. The GP11 preamp was the heart of it. 11 bands of graphic equalization, tuned specifically for bass frequencies, with the bands deliberately overlapping and bunched more closely at the bottom end. Because that's where a bass guitar lives, between 40 Hz and 400 Hz. And that's where conventional graphic EQs with evenly spaced bands left you with too little control over the frequencies that actually mattered. Add a switchable, pre-shape circuit, a single button that cut the mids and boosted the bass and treble at a stroke, delivering an instant scooped slap bass sound that would define the next decade of British pop, and you had something nobody else was offering. Bi-amplification outputs that let you send lows and highs through separate power amps, an XLR direct output for the front-of-house desk. And then the thing that made all of it unmistakable. A small 15-watt ultraviolet black light tube concealed behind the smoked glass front panel. The black light tube was ostensibly functional. Bass players work on dark stages. They need to see their controls. The UV lamp excited the phosphor-based silkscreen ink on the front panel and made it fluoresce a specific, unmistakable shade of iridescent green, somewhere between surgical scrub and nuclear coolant, a color that existed nowhere else in the music equipment world. On a dark stage, a Trace Elliot rig was a hovering rectangle of toxic green light. You saw it once, and you remembered it. German Wikipedia, with characteristic precision, still describes it simply. The front glows green when illuminated by black light. It became, within 3 years, the single most recognizable visual signature in professional bass. The naming story lives somewhere between pub mythology and corporate origin legend. Late one night in 1981, over beers at the Victoria pub in Romford, the Soundwave staff tried to christen the new range. Friedline wanted something that sounded classy and double-barreled, like Clark Technic, Mesa Boogie, or Seymour Duncan. An Australian technical designer on the team named Andy Perry suggested Elliot because it sounded both classy and British. Trace came straight off the shop's logo, the sine wave trace that nobody had paid much attention to. There was never a man named Trace Elliot. There was never a Stuart Elliot. The legend that the brand was founded by a person is one of the most persistent errors in bass amp history. The real names behind the brand were Friedline, Perry, and, most critically, a quiet, brilliant design engineer called Stuart Watson, who designed every Trace Elliot product through the Mark V series, and who, in late 1986, walked out of the company and out of the public record entirely. He is a ghost in the archive. The man whose circuit designs created the foundational Trace Elliot sound vanished from the industry at the precise moment Trace went global. Nobody, to this day, has published a photograph of Stuart Watson in connection with bass amplification. The brains behind the first half-decade disappeared, and the story carried on without him. Chapter 2. The Sheet Metal Man. In 1980, Fred Friedlane had a problem that had nothing to do with bass frequencies. He was paying a premium for his metalwork. Chassis, transformer covers, the brushed aluminium front panels that gave the GP11 its laboratory aesthetic. All of it was outsourced, and the bills were eating his margins. Metal fabrication in early 1980s, Essex was a seller's market. Friedline needed someone who could do it cheaper without doing it worse. A 20-year-old running a 30-person sheet metal shop in Essex offered to do exactly that. His name was Mark Gooday. He was a bass player. He'd grown up playing Black Sabbath covers with his mate Phil, who could play any guitar lick back after hearing it once. And he'd followed John Entwistle's bass tone with the same obsessive attention other boys his age reserved for football. He was running a proper business, 30 employees, bending and pressing metal for light industrial clients across the county. He wasn't looking for a career change. He was looking for a contract. Within a year, he was Trace Elliott's main metalwork supplier. Within 2, Friedline had decided that this particular young man with the bass-playing habit and the easy, disconcertingly candid manner was something more than a subcontractor. Friedlein wanted Gooday inside the company. Gooday wasn't sure. He had a functioning business. He had employees who depended on him. The money Friedlein was offering, a production director's salary, was less than he was making running his own shop. The deal-clinching scene belongs in this documentary. Friedlein drove out to the Gooday family home and personally charmed Gooday's wife over tea, explaining with practiced warmth how joining Trace Elliot was the best move her husband could possibly make. It's a gesture from a different era of British business, the founder driving to a man's house to win over his wife with a cup of tea and a pitch. It worked. Gooday joined as production director on reduced pay, with one complicating detail. After a year, the bottom line was that Fred owed me rather a lot of money. The debt was converted to equity. Gooday ended up with 25% of the company. He'd walked in as a metalworker. He walked out of that first year as a quarter owner of Britain's only dedicated bass amplifier manufacturer. By 1985, Friedlein was approaching his target retirement age, the 55 he'd planned for since the beginning, and was coming in less and less. He made Gooday managing director and topped his equity up to 24% in thanks for the growth and production changes made. The transition was Friedlein all over, planned, graceful, delegated to the person he'd chosen. He didn't hang on. He didn't second-guess. He'd built something, he'd hired well, and he stepped back. Gooday was a different animal from Friedlein entirely. Where Friedlein was measured, Gooday was fluent. Where Friedlein was a strategist, Gooday was a maker. He was obsessed with British manufacturing in the way that only someone who'd grown up bending metal with his hands could be, not as an abstract patriotic principle, but as a lived commitment to the idea that building things properly in your own country, with your own people, was worth the premium it cost. He idolized the way Status Graphite's Rob Green, who'd worked at the Soundwave shop before founding Status in 1982, thought about materials. He did not like being told to do things in a way he considered second-rate, and he would not, under any circumstances, be told to manufacture overseas. That conviction would one day cost him everything. It would also, eventually, save him. Alongside Gooday and the vanished Watson, 4 other names mattered, and each of them threads through the next 2 decades of this story in ways that would have been impossible to predict in the mid-1980s. Alan Morgan, a former bass player from the band Fusion, had been the original Soundwave shop manager. In 1983, he went to America to set up Trace Elliot USA, the export beachhead that would give the brand its first foothold outside Britain. Without Morgan, Trace Elliot might have remained a domestic success. With him, American bassists started seeing the green glow on the gear pages of Bass Player magazine. Clive Button was a freelance electronics designer engaged in late 1985 or 1986 to design for Trace out of his own facility. He was not a Trace Elliot employee. He was an independent mind, working from his own bench, and every single Trace Elliot product from 1985 to 1997 went through his workbench. He was the continuity. When Watson vanished, Button was the engineering brain that kept the product line evolving, and when the whole thing fell apart, he would quietly walk across to the other side of the story and start designing for the company that replaced Trace Elliot, while still, technically, designing for Trace. The same brain feeding both sides. Nobody at Gibson apparently noticed. Clive Roberts joined in time to co-develop the Trace acoustic range in 1989, the world's first dedicated acoustic instrument amplifier line, a product category that exists to this day, because 3 men in Molden decided acoustic guitarists deserved the same engineering attention bass players had received. Roberts would eventually become managing director. He would be the man standing in the factory when the lights went out. And Paul Stevens, who joined later, designed the Veloset guitar amplifier and the definitive V-type valve heads, the V4, the V6, and the extraordinary V8, a 400-watt, 8KT88 monster that became the cult classic tube head of the brand, the one professional bassists still hunt for in 2026. Stevens is worth remembering beyond Trace Elliot. He went on to design the Orange AD200, became chief engineer at Blackstar Amplification, and seeded the DNA of his Maldon era designs across 3 of the most consequential British amplifier brands of the 21st century. At its peak, Trace Elliot had 4 named designers, a retiring patriarch, a sheet metal managing director who'd never intended to be in the amplifier business, and a freelance genius working from a shed. The entire engineering capability of what would become one of the world's dominant bass amplifier manufacturers could have fitted into a transit van. Chapter 3. The Green Glow Conquers. The endorsement that built the legend arrived in 1981, the same year Trace Elliot got its name. A 23-year-old bassist from the Isle of Wight named Mark King walked into the Bass Centre in London and started using Trace gear. He was specific about it afterwards. I first started using Trace Elliot from 1981. Back then, it was about as high-end and high-fidelity as you could get. It started with the GP11. I've still got one of those, and then it went on to the GP12. King's timing was perfect for both parties. Level 42 were about to enter their imperial phase. King's slap bass technique, percussive and furious, was about to become the most copied sound in British pop, and that sound, the tight, scooped hi-fi crack of a thumb on a Music Man Stingray through a Trace Elliot GP11 with the pre-shape engaged, was about to be heard on every radio in Britain. King built a wall of green-glowing Trace combos on stage. Trace designed the 1-2-2-5V combo, a 2x10 with tweeter, essentially around him. When Level 42 played Top of the Pops, the green glow was there. When King's thumb landed on the strings for Lessons in Love, it was a Trace Elliot slap bass sound that came out. The brand and the artist fused. But King was the pop bassist. Trace needed the rock gods. They needed the heritage. And they got it. John Paul Jones of Led Zeppelin is cited across the earliest accounts as a pre-1982 Trace Elliot adopter, one of the very first professional bassists to switch to the new British rigs. Brian Helicopter of The Shapes, punk bassist, was the other early name. Andy Rourke of The Smiths, the Indie Kid, the Manchester Connection, a different audience entirely, is on every early users list. By the mid-1980s, Trace had assembled precisely what a bass amplifier manufacturer needed to achieve escape velocity: the pop bassist, the rock heritage, and the alternative credibility. 3 different audiences, 3 different scenes, 1 shade of green. The most consequential endorsement began at the NAMM show in January 1987. John Entwistle, The Who's thunder-fingered bassist, the man whose high-watt stacks had defined stadium bass in the 1970s, arguably the most influential electric bassist in rock history, met Mark Goodey. The connection was immediate and lifelong. Entwistle began specifying Trace Elliot custom racks for his enormous stage rigs. MP11, programmable graphic, EQ preamps, driving RA 500 power amps into ASS cabinets in a touring rack he called Little Manhattan. By the late 1990s, Entwistle was playing a V-Type Phi 8 as the mid-range section of a 3-amplifier on-stage system. The V8's grinding, harmonically rich valve tone, audible on every Who reunion tour, until he died in a Las Vegas hotel room on the 27th of June 2002. Entwistle matters to this story for a reason beyond endorsement. He was the bridge, the bassist who followed Goodey. When Trace Elliot collapsed and Goodey started again from nothing, Entwistle was the first artist to say yes. That loyalty, built in 1987, tested in 1997, honoured until death, is one of the threads that holds the entire Trace to Ashdown arc together. Around these core endorsees, a cloud of professional bassists adopted Trace through the late 1980s and 1990s, and the list reads like a timeline of British and international bass itself. Doug Wimbish, Living Colour, Tackhead, one of the most technically formidable bassists alive, ran 2 AH1200-12 heads in stereo into 1048H and 1518 cabinets, and has used Trace continuously for over 3 decades. Stuart Zender of Jamiroquai played through an AH300 into a 1048H at the 1995 North Sea Jazz Festival, and used a V8 on Travelling Without Moving. Roger Glover of Deep Purple toured with Trace in the 1990s. Pete Trewavas of Marillion used Trace through Clutching at Straws and Brave. Guy Pratt played Trace on Pink Floyd's 1987 A Momentary Lapse of Reason tour, and Trace released a compilation CD with him titled with perfect understatement, also available in green. The Colchester Gazette would later list Eric Clapton, Mark Knopfler and Oasis in the Factory's closure obituary. the kind of stars such as a small Essex town had quietly supplied without anyone outside the bass-playing world particularly noticing. Geezer Butler, Peter Hook, Tony Levin, Les Pattinson, Roger Daltrey, Martin Lenoble. The names kept accumulating, and behind every one of them, on every dark stage, the green glow. Product development cascaded through the decade at a pace that reflected the small team energy of the Maldon operation. The GP12 SMX, launched in 1993, added a 12th graphic EQ band, dual-band compression, a blendable valve and solid-state input stage, dual pre-shapes, and a balanced direct injection output. A preamp so feature-dense that it became the Swiss Army knife of professional bass. The 1110 combo bundled a GP11 preamp with a V5 MOSFET power section into a 4x10 box, and became the definitive gigging bass combo of the late 1980s, the amp that occupied the backline of every London rehearsal studio, from Clink Street to Nomis. The Trace Acoustic TA series of 1989 created an entirely new product category, a purpose-designed amplifier range for acoustic instruments, developed jointly by Friedlein, Gooday, Clive Roberts, and Clive Button. Acoustic guitarists had been plugging into PA systems the way bass players had in 1979. Trace solved the problem the same way, by building something nobody had thought to build. And then there were the V-types. Paul Stevens's all-valve heads, the V4 at 200 watts, the V6 at 300, and the V8 at 400 watts, driven by 8 KT88 power tubes through Demeter custom output transformers, with an EM84 Magic Eye tuning display on the front panel that made the whole thing look like a piece of 1950s laboratory equipment, became the objects of cult devotion that the brand's solid-state amps had never quite inspired. Fewer than 80 V8S were ever built. John Entwistle played one at the Royal Albert Hall in 2002, weeks before his death. They are hunted today like vintage guitars, everyone accounted for, everyone carrying a serial number that somebody on TalkBass has catalogued. The sound, from the very first units to the very last, was idiosyncratic and recognizable. Bassists have been arguing about trace tone for 20 years with broadly consistent adjectives: punchy, articulate, hi-fi, clean, tight, creamy. Trace owns punchy, one TalkBass user wrote flatly. There's watts, and then there's trace watts, wrote another. Cranked, the V-type heads grew into what players describe as a grinding, growling beast. Dirty, sweaty, grease under your fingernails tone that overdrove naturally into something smooth and musical. Clean, the solid-state heads were polished and precise, the graphic EQ delivering surgical control over frequencies that competing manufacturers didn't bother to address. With the pre-shape engaged, plus 6 decibels at 50 Hz, minus 6 at 400, plus 6, again between 2 and 5 kHz. You got the mid-scooped smiley face EQ curve that defined British slap bass on 1980s radio, the sound of Mark King's thumb, the sound of a decade. By 1988, Trace Elliot had moved from Romford to Braintree Road, Witham. 18 employees in a compact unit on the A12 corridor, building amps that were appearing on the biggest stages in the world. By 1989, they'd moved again, to Galliford Road, Maldon, a small market town on the Blackwater estuary, best known for its salt works, its Thames sailing barges, and for losing the Battle of Molden to the Vikings in 991 AD. Each move went deeper into rural Essex. Each move went further from the capital. Each move scaled the operation up, and the next move, the one into the 110,000 square foot shed on the Blackwater trading estate, would scale it past the point of no return. But that was still a few years away. In 1989, Trace Elliot was a small company doing something nobody else in Britain was doing it brilliantly, and doing it from a market town where the loudest sound most afternoons was the cry of oyster catchers on the estuary mudflats. A factory that glowed green in a town that made salt. Chapter 4. The Shed on the Blackwater. Around 1993 or 1994, Trace Elliot moved into its final home, a 110,000 square foot facility on the Blackwater trading estate, the Causeway, Heybridge, Molden, CM94GG. The building itself was everything a late 20th century British light industrial premises was supposed to be, and nothing more. Steel portal frame construction, corrugated metal cladding, flat reclaimed land along the tidal Blackwater estuary, anonymous enough that you would drive past it on the A414 if you weren't looking. It sat on the edge of a small market town of 15,000 people, whose other major employer was Maldon Crystal Salt, the sea salt works whose flaky white crystals were beginning to appear in the kitchens of aspirational cooks across Britain. One factory made salt, the other made the green-lit amplifiers behind half the bass players on British radio. If you lived in Molden in 1995 and didn't play bass, there was a reasonable chance you didn't know the second factory existed. Inside, it was a different world. Walk through the loading bay doors on a Tuesday morning in 1995, and the first thing that hit you wasn't the sight of the place. It was the smell. Hot solar from the wave-soldering bath, which exhaled its acrid sweet flux cloud in a low, persistent plume across the electronics assembly area. New Tolex vinyl, that particular rubbery chemical scent of the covering material being stretched and glued around the speaker cabinets. Freshly cut MDF from the cabinet shop, where the wooden enclosures were being routed, assembled and braced, and underneath all of it, the faint mineral oil of the sheet metal press, where Mark Gooday's original craft, the chassis bending, the front panel cutting, the transformer cover forming, was still being done on site by people who'd learned the same trade Gooday had practiced as a 20-year-old. The electronics assembly area ran in rows of anti-static benches under cold fluorescent light. Through-hole PCB assembly was the standard. This was before the surface mount revolution had fully reached the MY industry, and the workforce at those benches was predominantly women, as it was across the British light electronics sector. They soldered components by hand into the printed circuit boards, resistors, capacitors, transistors, the MOSFET output devices that gave Trace its power stage character. Completed boards went through the wave soldering bath, where a standing wave of molten solder washed across the underside of the PCB and sealed every joint in a single pass. The bath was the heartbeat of the electronics floor. You could hear it, a low, persistent electrical hum underneath the occasional pneumatic hiss of the tools, and you could smell it from 30 feet away, that specific flux and tin combination that anyone who has worked in electronics assembly carries in their memory for life. From the soldering benches, completed amplifier boards moved to the chassis assembly stations, where they were mounted into the pressed steel and aluminium housings. The front panels, the ones that would glow green, were silk screened with the phosphor-based ink, fitted with their control knobs and graphic EQ sliders, and then tested at the blacklight station. Flick a switch and a row of newly fitted front panels erupted in that iridescent green. The QC technician checked for dead pixels in the silkscreen, misaligned controls, cold solder joints, visible through the smoked glass window. Each panel that passed went into the assembly line. Each one that didn't went back. The cabinet shop occupied its own section of the building, and it smelled different. Woodier, dustier, closer to a carpentry workshop than an electronics factory. Here, the speaker enclosures were being built. MDF panels cut to size, routed for the speaker cutouts and the port tubes, braced internally with struts that stiffened the box against the physical vibration of bass frequencies pushing against the enclosure walls. The panels were glued, clamped, stapled. The pneumatic cabinet stapler's sharp crack punctuating the workshop at irregular intervals, like a snare drum with no sense of rhythm, and then covered in Tolex or, in later years, a carpet covering that forum posters would note as a small but telling cheapening. Speakers were mounted, wiring looms were fitted, crossover networks were installed in the bi-amped cabinets, handles went on, casters went on the big ones, corner protectors went on all of them, and then the testing. Every completed amplifier head went onto the QC bench, where it was powered up, connected to a dummy load, and run through its paces at volume. The thump of a newly assembled head being tested at full power, a bass signal driven through 500 watts of MOSFET output stage into a resistive load, was a felt thing as much as a hard thing, a physical displacement of air that you registered in your chest before your ears processed it. After the bench test, the amp went onto the burn-in racks, rows of 20 completed heads running at low output for a sustained period, proving reliability, flushing out infant mortality component failures before the amp ever left the building. The burn-in rack hummed, 20 green glowing front panels, all lit, all running, all waiting to be signed off and shipped. That sign-off was the last human touch. Every amp carried an internal QC sticker, and every sticker was signed by hand. The name of the technician who'd tested it, the date, the serial number. It was the reason Trace had a reputation for road reliability. Not quality management systems, not ISO certification. A person with a name who'd put their signature on the work. One forum commenter remembers turning a new Trace Elliot amp on for the first time and noticing a smell he couldn't identify. Somehow comforting, he wrote. A reply came back from another user. That's the smell of Trace Elliot himself. There was no Trace Elliot, of course. There never had been. But there were 200 people in a shed in Molden who, between them, built every one of those amps by hand. And something of those hands, those benches, that flux cloud and that Tolex smell and that particular Tuesday morning quality of Essex light through corrugated cladding went out the door with every unit. Chapter 5. Salt Town, Green Light. At its peak, Trace Elliot employed around 200 people at the Molden factory. They were mostly local, Heybridge, Witham, Chelmsford, Maldon itself, and they were the standard workforce of late 20th century British light electronics. The demographics told a familiar story. Skilled women on the PCB assembly benches, men in the cabinet shop and the sheet metal section, a small R&D team of designers and engineers, a finishing and shipping crew, office staff handling orders and exports. They clocked in, they worked their shift, they clocked out. Some of them drove, some of them walked. Heybridge is a small enough place that you could walk from your front door to the Blackwater trading estate in 15 minutes and still have time for a cigarette before the shift started. Maldon is not an industrial town in the way that Sheffield is an industrial town, or Coventry, or Stoke. It is a market town on a tidal estuary in rural Essex, a place of Norman churches and weatherboarded houses, and the Hythe Quay, where the Thames sailing barges still moor. It had been a working town since before the Domesday Book. Salt production on the Blackwater estuary goes back to the Iron Age, but it had never been a factory town. It didn't have the terraced housing grids that grew up around the northern mills, the social clubs built by the works, the generation's deep identity of a place whose reason for existing was a single employer. Trace Elliot was Molden's largest private sector employer, but it wasn't Molden's identity. Molden's identity was salt, barges, the estuary, the Viking battle, and a genteel Essex market town respectability that sat oddly alongside a factory full of people building the amps behind Black Sabbath's bass player. What Trace Elliot was, for the people who worked there, was a good job in a place where good jobs were not unlimited. Light electronics assembly paid reasonably. The work was skilled, wave soldering, hand assembly, QC testing, and it carried the particular pride of making a product that had a name, a reputation, and a visible presence in the world. Your neighbour might not know what Trace Elliot was, but you knew. You knew because you'd see Mark King on top of the pops and the green glow would be there behind him, and you'd know that the amp he was playing through had been across your bench 3 months ago, and your signature was inside it on a QC sticker. The multi-generational patterns that defined the great northern industrial works, grandfather, father, son, all through the same gates, didn't have time to develop at Trace. The company had only existed since 1978. It would only last as a manufacturing operation in Maldon until 2002. 24 years is a career, not a dynasty. But what did develop was something smaller and more specific. A factory culture built around the knowledge that what you were making mattered to the people who used it. Bass amplifiers are not anonymous consumer goods. They are tools used by professionals under extreme conditions. Dark stages, loud volumes, punishing transport schedules, the sweat and beer and electrical interference of 1,000 pub gigs and arena tours. An amp that fails on stage fails publicly, in front of an audience, with consequences for the player's livelihood. The hand-signed QC sticker wasn't a formality, it was a promise, and there was one particular child who grew up in and around this factory, a boy who moved from school in Witham to school in Maldon as the company moved, who spent his afternoons after school in the woodshop among the MDF dust and the cabinet staplers. His name was Dan Gooday. He was Mark Gooday's son. He would one day run Ashdown Engineering. But in 1993 or 1994, he was a schoolboy wandering past burn-in racks at 4 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon, watching 20 green-glowing front panels hum in unison, absorbing through proximity and repetition the rhythms of a factory that his father had helped build, and that would, within a decade, cease to exist. It is, among other things, a story about a child and his father's factory, about what you learn by being in the room where the work happens, before you're old enough to understand what you're learning. Chapter 6. The World's Default Bass Rig. By the mid-1990s, Trace Elliot occupied a cultural position in professional bass that was simultaneously dominant and oddly invisible. If you were a touring bassist in Britain, Trace was the default. If you were a serious amateur saving up for your first proper rig, Trace was the aspiration. If you were an American bassist shopping for a modern hi-fi sound, Trace was one half of the only choice that mattered. A 90s thing, as one forum writer put it, seemed you either went SWR or TE for that modern hi-fi sound. And if you were anyone else, a casual music listener, a non-musician, a resident of Molden who didn't play bass, you had almost certainly never heard of it. The range at peak was enormous for a company of 200 people. The 1995 Trace Elliot pocket catalogue ran across 4 main families. The AH series heads climbed from the AH130 at the entry level through the AH250, AH300, AH500, and up to the AH1200-12 flagship, 1200 watts into a 12-band graphic EQ preamp, enough clean headroom to fill an arena without breaking a sweat. The combos ran from the BLX80 practice amp, nicknamed the Dog's Bollocks in-house, the letters surviving, inexplicably, in the product code, through the Mark King designed 1225V 2x10s, up to the 300-watt 4x10 gig machines that occupied the backline of every professional rehearsal studio in London. The cabinets ranged from the iconic 1048H 4x10, the workhorse, the standard, the one you saw on every stage, through single 15s, double 15s, single 18s, and the double 18 low-end monsters that moved enough air to rearrange the furniture. The Trace Acoustic TA line offered dedicated acoustic amplification at 50, 100, and 200 watts. The V-type valve heads occupied the top of the range, hand-built in smaller numbers, priced accordingly, and at the margins, a handful of pedals and the eccentric Velocette and Super Tramp guitar combos. Trace's tentative, never-quite-committed foray into Gibson's territory. Prices ran from around £450 for a Trace Acoustic TA, 100 to over 1,500 for a V8. This was not cheap equipment. A working bassist buying a Trace Elliot AH 300 head and a 1048H cabinet in 1995 was spending close to £1,000, a month's wages for many of the people building them in Maldon. It was professional gear at professional prices, and that positioning was part of the brand's identity. You didn't buy a Trace because it was affordable. You bought a Trace because you were serious. The competition was real and named. Ampeg, from St. Louis, had the SVT, the rock warhorse, the valve monster, heavy as a coffin and voiced like a freight train. Hartke, from New York, had the aluminium cone cabinets that gave a bright, aggressive attack. SWR, from Sun Valley, California, had the hi-fi hybrid heads that were Trace's closest tonal competitor. Gallion Kruger, from San Jose, had the lightweight 800 RB that was becoming the working musician's secret weapon. Eden, from Montrose, Minnesota, had the premium boutique positioning. Against all of them, Trace offered the most feature-rich package in the market. 12-band graphic EQ, plus pre-shape, plus valve drive blend, plus dual-band compressor, plus biamp crossover, plus balanced DI, all in one head, all of it glowing green. No other manufacturer packed that much into a single chassis. The green glow was the signature, but the specification sheet was the substance. The cultural footprint was visual as much as it was sonic. One Talkbass user remembers seeing Emerson, Lake and Palmer on American television, and Greg Lake was standing in front of a wall of those black and green cabs. Looked awesome. The green-fronted Trace stack became a shorthand for professionalism, for British engineering, for a certain kind of seriousness about low-frequency reproduction. It was on the Jules Holland later-end bandstand. It was behind level 42 on top of the Pops. It was in every professional rehearsal studio from Clink Street to Nomis. In Molden, a town of 15,000 people whose other major employer was a saltworks, a factory built the green-lit amps behind half the bass players on British radio, and nobody outside bass players particularly noticed. The much-repeated claim that Jaco Pastorius used Trace Elliot is false. Jaco died in September 1987. His rigs were acoustic 360s and stock Fender amps. The myth persists because Jaco is the patron saint of bass, and every bass equipment brand benefits from association with his name, but the timeline doesn't work and the gear doesn't match. The documentary should be honest about this. Trace Elliott's endorsement list is extraordinary enough without fabricating a connection to a man who died before the GP12 SMX was designed. What Trace Elliot actually had, by 1995, was something rarer than a celebrity endorsement: Ubiquity. They hadn't just built a famous amp, they'd built the amp. The one that was there, behind the bassist, on the stage, in the rehearsal room, on the session, on the tour, night after night, in the dark. The default. The thing you didn't think about because it was always there. And that kind of ubiquity, invisible, taken for granted, built on the assumption that it would continue, is the most fragile kind of dominance there is. Chapter 7. The Gentleman's Exit. In 1992, Fred Friedlein turned 55. He had hit his retirement target, the 5-year plan he'd drawn up when he was 50, the discipline that had defined him from the beginning, and he wanted out. He had built a company that employed 200 people, supplied the professional bass world, and carried a name he'd invented over beers in a Romford pub. He had hired well and delegated widely. Now he was done. He had already offered the entire company to Mark Goode at a very low price. Goode hesitated. Not because he didn't want it, he did, but because he believed Trace needed American distribution muscle to reach the next level, and he knew that the company's US distributor, Kaman Music Corporation, would not seriously promote a brand it didn't own. The logic was sound. The American market was 3 times the size of the European market. Trace's US presence, built by Alan Morgan from 1983, was established but not dominant. To compete with Ampeg and SWR on their home turf, you needed a distributor with catalogs and sales reps and warehouse space across 50 states. Kaman had all of it. The Kaman story is worth pausing on because it matters to what happens next. Kaman Corporation of Bloomfield, Connecticut was, and is, primarily a maker of helicopters. Charles Kaman, the founder, was an aviation engineer who had diversified into musical instruments in 1966 when he invented the Ovation round-backed acoustic guitar, a product that came directly out of helicopter engineering, the fiberglass composite body, designed using the same techniques Kaman applied to rotor blades. By the early 1990s, Kaman Music was a substantial musical instrument distributor. Ovation guitars, hammer guitars, takamine, later Latin percussion, and Gens Benz. Bill Kaman II, Charles Kaman's son, ran the music division. They had been distributing Trace Elliot in the US since Morgan set up the office in 1983. Trace Elliot was sold to Kaman in 1992 at a reported turnover of approximately $5 million. The deal was negotiated between Bill Kaman II and Friedlein, with Goode participating as managing director and 24% shareholder. Friedlein took his exit money and set up a small PA company called Sound Ranger. Goode and Kaman remained personal friends. Years later, after everything had collapsed, Goode could still say he actually owns 4 or 5 Ashdowns. For the first year or two, the Kaman deal looked good. American capital, American distribution, a parent company that understood the MI industry. Goode kept running the factory. The product kept shipping. The green glow kept appearing on stages. And then, in Goode's telling, the thing that would eventually kill Trace Elliot happened, not the Gibson acquisition, not the factory closure, but a decision made in a Connecticut boardroom in 1995 that would leave Molden fatally overextended for the rest of its existence. Kaman decided to turn the Maldon factory into a centralized European distribution hub for the entire Kaman portfolio. Not just Trace Elliot amps, Ovation guitars, Hamer guitars, the whole catalog. The plan required a much larger building. That was why Trace moved into the vast 110,000 square foot Blackwater trading estate facility. John Booth, who would later head Roland UK, was hired to run the distribution arm. The building was leased. The staff were hired. The infrastructure was put in place. 6 months later, Kaman pulled the capital. The helicopter business needed money. The European distribution plan evaporated. Trace Elliot was left rattling around in a shed twice the size it could afford, paying rent on 55,000 square feet of empty space, with a workforce scaled for a distribution operation that no longer existed. Gooday knew immediately that this was the wound. Not the killing blow, that was still years away, but the wound that would make the killing blow possible. He spent 1996 trying to buy the company back from Kamen. Kamen refused. He offered his resignation. Kamen didn't accept. The SMX series began showing quality problems in the field. Transformers failing, unreliable valve designs, warranty returns climbing, and the blame for those failures stuck to Gooday, personally inside Kamen's management structure. The man who'd built the factory was being held responsible for problems created by the capital withdrawal that had destabilized his operation. And then, 10 days before my contract was up, they let me go, as they say. It's the way Americans do business. You walk away with something after a disagreement, but probably not what you were entitled to. It was late 1996 or early 1997. Mark Gooday was 50 years old. He had a 6-month non-compete clause. He had a family, a mortgage, 2 children in private education, and no job. His 24% equity in Trace Elliot had been diluted by the Kamen acquisition to the point where his departure payment was enough to cover the immediate bills, but not enough to start over. The man who had joined Fred Friedline as a 20-year-old sheet metal worker, who had become managing director, who had built the factory, who had hired the workforce, who had shaken John Entwistle's hand at NAM in 1987 and turned that handshake into the most consequential base endorsement in British history. That man was out of work in rural Essex with a non-compete clause, preventing him from doing the only thing he knew how to do. The factory carried on without him. The green glow still lit up the Molden production line. 200 people still clocked in each morning. But something had shifted. The man whose name appeared nowhere on the products, who had no signature model, no public profile, no industry fame beyond the tight circle of trade journalists and base professionals, was gone. And the company he'd built was now owned by people who made helicopters, managed from Connecticut, and were about to sell it to a man in Nashville who wanted to be the Nike of music. That was the summit, the highest point before the fall. And standing there, nobody inside those walls could see the cliff they were about to walk off. Chapter 8. 3 directors and a velocette. In June 1997, Kamen Music Corporation took a $10.4 million pre-tax charge to exit Trace Elliot. They had owned the company for 5 years. They had expanded the factory to a size it couldn't sustain, pulled the capital that was supposed to justify the expansion, and fired the managing director who'd built it. Now they wanted out. The exit was an internal management buyout. A trio of existing Trace Elliot directors, led by Clive Roberts, the man who'd co-developed the Trace acoustic range with Friedline and Gooday 8 years earlier, bought the company for what appears to have been a modest sum. The precise figure was never disclosed. They inherited a company of roughly 200 staff on a 110,000 square foot site that was commercially unraveling. Too much floor space, too little revenue. Quality problems in the SMX series, sticking to the brand's reputation like flux residue. The buyout trio had a strategy, and the strategy had a name. Paul Stevens's Velocette, the 15-watt Class A EL 84 guitar combo he'd designed as a Trace Elliot curiosity, was their calling card. It was a beautiful little amplifier, warm, articulate, hand-built, exactly the kind of boutique British valve amp that American guitarists were beginning to pay serious money for. The trio focused on pushing into the American market, where Trace's bass profile was established but not dominant, and where the Velocette gave them a second product category to sell. Within a year, they were in serious conversations with the one company in America that had the deepest interest in owning a British boutique guitar amplifier with a factory and an engineering team attached to it, Gibson Guitar Corporation. To understand what happened to Trace Elliot in October 1998, you have to understand the man on the other side of the table. Henry Yuskiewicz was born in 1953 in Poland, moved to Rochester, New York at age 5, trained as a mechanical engineer at the General Motors Institute, and took an MBA at Harvard Business School in 1979. He briefly worked in mergers and acquisitions in New York, then in 1981 joined 2 Harvard classmates, David H. Berryman and Gary A. Zabrowski, to acquire a small Oklahoma electronics firm called Phi Technologies. They turned it profitable within a month. In January 1986, the trio bought Gibson from Norlin Corporation, the Ecuadorian beer and concrete conglomerate whose neglect had nearly destroyed the American guitar-making icon, for approximately $5 million. Ubiquity made Gibson profitable within a month. For the next decade, he was genuinely the savior of Gibson. He restored the Les Paul to its proper specification. He built the custom shop. He hired back retired luthiers. He reversed a quality collapse that had made 1970s Gibsons a laughingstock among professional players. The first wave of acquisitions, Flatiron Mandolin, Steinberger, Tobias Basses, Kramer, Slingerland Drums, Oberheim, Valley Arts, built out what Ubiquity called a full-line music instrument company. It was coherent strategy. Each brand occupied a distinct niche. Each brought engineering talent or market share or both. The problem started when his ambition grew past the music instrument business. His phrase, which appears across interviews from the late 1990s onwards, was that Gibson would become the Nike of music lifestyle. We don't see ourselves as a guitar company. We see ourselves as a music lifestyle company. The acquisition strategy shifted from buying instrument brands to buying consumer audio. Stanton DJ equipment, KRK studio monitors, Serwin Vega loudspeakers, Cakewalk music software, a majority stake in TAC/Tascam in 2013, part of Onkyo in 2012, and then, in April 2014, the Philips Audio, Video and Multimedia Division, WUX Innovations, for $135 million, plus a 7-year brand license fee. Ubiquity told the press it would triple Gibson overnight. It did. It also loaded the company with over $500 million of debt. Industry insiders described him in terms that sound familiar in retrospect. Aggressive management style, low morale on the assembly lines, attrition of some veteran craftspeople. George Gruen, a Nashville dealer, was blunter. You have to eat so much garbage in order to be a Gibson dealer. Inside Gibson, he was known simply as Henry. By 2011, Gibson was being raided by US Fish and Wildlife for Lacey Act violations on illegally imported rosewood and ebony. They paid a $300,000 fine in 2012. The man who'd saved Gibson from Norlin was building a conglomerate that had the same structural weaknesses as Norlin. Too many brands, too much debt, too little attention paid to the things that actually made money. Trace Elliot was early in the catalogue, a small British bass amp factory on a tidal estuary in Essex, acquired before the real madness began. The Buyout trio reportedly made an awful lot of money out of so doing. Mark Gooday, by then running an amp company out of his dining room a few miles away, watched from the outside. Chapter 9. The Green Glow Fades. Gibson's stated rationale for acquiring Trace Elliot was the Velocette. Paul Stevens's little 15-watt guitar combo was exactly the kind of boutique, British valve amplifier Gibson wanted to rebadge as the revived Gibson Goldtone line, a callback to Gibson's own 1950s amp heritage. The Molden factory and its engineering staff would build Gibson-branded guitar amplifiers. Trace Elliott's bass business would continue alongside. They did build the Gibson Goldtones at Molden. The GA15, GA15RV, and GA30 RVS were the direct result, cosmetic rebadges of the Velocette. On the Reverb marketplace today, you can still find Gibson Goldtones whose internal circuit boards are stamped Velocette in 3 places and which carry a Velocette sticker inside a Gibson-labelled cabinet. There were 2 variants, a brown and gold UK-built version and a later black and gold version built in Chicago once production moved. The amps were competent. The branding was cynical. A British-designed circuit in a British-built cabinet, stripped of its British name and stamped with the Gibson mark, sold to American guitarists who didn't know or didn't care that the thing they were buying had been born as a Trace Elliot product in an Essex factory. Core Gibson electric guitars were not made at Molden. Slingerland drums were not made at Molden. Molden remained an amp factory. What changed was everything around the amps. Gooday, watching from the outside, expected Gibson to pour resources into Trace Elliot, marketing budgets, American distribution muscle, the kind of promotional firepower that a Nashville-based guitar empire could bring to bear on a specialist bass brand. His account, from a 2005 interview that remains the single most detailed primary source for this period, is one of bewilderment. It was very strange, expecting Gibson to make Trace Elliot this huge thing in America, throw loads of money at it and streamline it. But I was gobsmacked. They stayed in that same humongous building. I never saw the advertising, marketing or promotion stepped up. The advertising disappeared. Not reduced. disappeared. The catalogue pages thinned. The website went static. Dealers stopped seeing new product announcements. Trace Elliot's trade press presence, which had been constant and visible through the Cayman years, contracted to near silence. In a market where visibility is everything, where a bass player chooses their next amp based on what they see at trade shows, what they read in Bass Player magazine, what their favourite bassist is playing on tour, Trace Elliot was allowed to become invisible. Paul Stevens stayed on and continued designing. The Mark II V8, launched in 2000, was by some accounts the finest amplifier Trace Elliot ever produced. A refinement of the original V8's already extraordinary circuit, with improved biasing and a tighter, more articulate low end. The engineering hadn't degraded. The products that came out of Molden under Gibson's ownership, particularly at the top of the range, were among the best Trace had ever built. The contrarian view, expressed by forum users with long memories, is that Gibson-era Trace amps were actually superb, but nobody at Gibson told anyone they existed. And here is the detail that compresses the entire Gibson era into a single, devastating irony. Clive Button, the freelance electronics designer who had designed every Trace Elliot product from 1985 to 1997, continued designing for Trace under Gibson's ownership. He also, quietly, began designing the full Ashdown product line for Mark Goode. The same brain was feeding both sides. Gibson had the same engineer designing products for its own competitor, and nobody in Nashville apparently noticed. It tells you everything you need to know about how closely Gibson was paying attention to the small factory on the Blackwater estuary. The Molden cabinet shop quietly switched some 1048H cabinets from the traditional Tolex covering to a cheaper carpet material. Post-Gibson amps were stamped "Made in the United Kingdom" rather than the earlier "Made in England." A branding shift small enough to miss and large enough to see, if you were the kind of person who noticed such things. Bass players noticed. They noticed the way you notice a friend losing weight. Gradually, then all at once. Meanwhile, Goode was taking the business. I know that within 3 years I'd taken at least 50% of their UK business and possibly more of their world business, except in the USA, where Gibson had got going. A man in a dining room in Molden with no factory, no distribution network, no marketing budget, and a freelance designer he shared with his former employer was eating Gibson's lunch. The green glow was fading not because the amps had gotten worse. It was fading because the people who owned the name had stopped caring whether anyone could see it. Chapter 10. 15 January 2002. In December 2001, the Trace Elliot workforce at Molden was told the factory would close. Clive Roberts delivered the announcement. The man who had co-developed the Trace acoustic range with Friedline and Goode. The man who had led the management buyout from Cayman. The man who had negotiated the sale to Gibson. Now, the man standing in front of his colleagues, explaining that their jobs were finished. The workforce had already contracted from its 200-person peak. Roberts told the Colchester Gazette that, at one time, more than 100 people were employed in Molden. 44 people lost their jobs in the final round. 44. Not a number that makes national news. Not a number that triggers parliamentary questions or regional development funds. 44 people in a small Essex town, building amplifiers that most of their neighbours had never heard of, told before Christmas that January would be their last month. Roberts's explanation, quoted in the only contemporaneous press account, the Gazette's "Molden 40 jobs go at music firm," was corporate in its phrasing and small in its ambition. The factory unit in Molden was considered too big for the company's needs, so bosses decided the time was right for restructuring. The factory unit was too big because Cayman had made it too big in 1995 for a European distribution plan they'd cancelled 6 months later. The company's needs had shrunk because Gibson had starved the brand of visibility for 3 years. The restructuring meant closure. The passive voice did what passive voice always does in redundancy announcements. It made the decision sound like weather, something that happened, not something that someone chose. The Gazette writer added the only touch of public recognition the factory would receive. For the past 11 years, Trace Elliot has been manufacturing amplification equipment in the town for stars such as Eric Clapton, Mark Knopfler, and Oasis. Stars such as a small-town newspaper reaching for the famous names that might make its readers understand what had been in their midst. Clapton, Knopfler, Oasis. names that landed differently in Molden than they did in Nashville. Robert said he was still hoping some of the company's manufacturing business could stay in the town on a reduced scale. That hope went unfulfilled. Gibson relocated what little Trace production continued to various locations in the United States. The Maldon factory fell silent. The affected staff left the building on Tuesday, the 15th of January 2002. There is no record of union involvement. There is no record of a media campaign. There is no record of worker testimonies in the national press. No vigils. No marches. No politicians standing at the gates making promises about regeneration. A light industrial factory in a small Essex town, employing 44 people at the end, closed quietly, and the only people who noticed outside Molden were the bass players, wondering why the green amps were vanishing from dealer showrooms. John Entwistle played his V8 at the Royal Albert Hall that same year. He died in Las Vegas on the 27th of June 2002, 5 months after the factory that built his amplifiers closed its doors. The amp survived him. The factory didn't survive the year. Gooday's reaction, recorded 3 years later, is disbelief rather than anger. What happened at the end, I don't know. It just seemed to come to a grinding halt. The trade journalist Gary Cooper, whose 2005 interview remains the richest published source on the Gooday account, supplied the industry's epitaph. What eventually became of the Trace Elliot brand is one of the great Marie Celeste mysteries of modern MI times. How such an exceptional brand name could have been left to flounder beggars belief. The factory building did not stay empty long. Within a few years, it was reportedly repurposed to manufacture Orange amplifiers via the Matamp/Orange UK connection. Molden kept making amps, just not Trace ones. The irony writes itself. Cliff Cooper's Orange, which Gibson had briefly held a license for between 1993 and 1997, ended up in the building Gibson had just abandoned. Chapter 11. The dining room. Here the story folds back on itself. Because, while Gibson was quietly letting Trace Elliot atrophy from October 1998 onwards, the company that would eventually inherit its legacy had already been running for 14 months, out of a dining room in Molden, a mile from the factory. On the day his common non-compete clause expired, in mid-1997, Mark Gooday founded Ashdown Engineering. The name came from his wife Jane's family surname. The logo, a double-wing badge, was a love letter to the Austin Healey mark. Gooday was Carmad, always had been. The full plan name of the first amplifier was, and this is worth savouring, the Klystron Bass Magnifier, taken directly from Dr. Zarkov's line in Flash Gordon, "Turn up the Klystron Magnifier." It got shortened to Ashdown Bass Magnifier, ABM, for trademark reasons. The initials stuck. The amplifier they named would become the template of modern British bass amplification. The startup capital came from raw personal liquidation. I sold everything I had. All my guitars, my cars, everything I had, and I owe a great thank you to Barry Morehouse at the Bass Centre over that, because he kept a few of my classic basses, so that when I made some money again, I could go back and get them, which I did. He left Cameron with an overdraft. His wife Jane went back to work immediately. He had 2 children in private school, and no car. I admit, I spent a few days with my head in my hands, thinking, oh shit! Then he picked up the phone. He rang his old Trace export customers, dealers in Germany, distributors in Japan, contacts across Europe he'd built over 15 years. Letters of credit came back on nothing more than a photograph of a prototype and a price list. They weren't buying an amplifier. They were buying Mark Gooday's name. The man who'd built Trace Elliott's production operation was asking them to trust that he could do it again. They did. For the first 3 years, Ashdown Engineering operated out of the Gooday family dining room. Cabinets were subcontracted to a Molden carpentry shop. PCBs were built at the back of his house. The ABM amplifiers were hand-assembled every evening around the dining table by Mark, Jane, Dan and his daughter Daisy. During the day, Mark drove the country in a hired car visiting dealers and artists. At night, he came home and built amps. Clive Button came across. The freelance electronics designer who had created every Trace Elliot product from 1985 to 1997 agreed to design a full Ashdown product line. An industry trade account describes the result. A full product line with his former Trace Elliot co-worker, Clive Button, in just 6 months. The engineering brain that had made Trace what it was now belonged to its successor. The ABM was designed around two decisions that would define Ashdown's identity for the next 3 decades. The first was that the front panel would carry a backlit analog VU meter, a feature Gooday had pitched to Trace Elliot management and been told was a gimmick. The needle shivers to the beat. It gives the bass player a visual read on their signal that a row of LEDs cannot replicate. It also looks extraordinary, warm, blue-lit, alive, a piece of vintage instrumentation on a modern amplifier. Our VU meter has become the most recognized feature of Ashdown amps, the company now states. So much so that we needn't put the Ashdown logo visibly on the front of our amps anymore. The second decision was tonal. The ABM preamp offered a valve drive blend into a solid-state output stage, warmer than classic Trace, closer to the Ampeg end of the spectrum, with more harmonic complexity and less of the clinical hi-fi precision that had defined the Trace Elliot sound. Where Trace was surgical, Ashdown was organic. Where Trace was the operating theatre, Ashdown was the pub after closing. Both were British. Both were built in Molden. They were different answers to the same question. The founding scene that Gooday tells with the most affection is Entwistle's birthday. I can vividly remember sitting up, watching TV at 3 a.m, building John Entwistle's first amp for his birthday, then driving it there for 9 or 10 the next morning and finding that he didn't get up till 3 or 4. Entwistle was the first major endorser. John Entwistle helped me in so many ways. He really did help to start the company. Mark King followed. J.J. Burnell of the Stranglers followed. Pino Palladino came across in 1998. In 2000, on the eve of sessions for U2's All That You Can't Leave Behind, Gooday shipped a range of Ashdown heads, cabs and combos to Dublin for Adam Clayton to audition. Clayton chose the ABM. His bass tech, Stuart Morgan, fed back the line Gooday would repeat for years. Adam is delighted with the rig, and that discovering Ashdown was like the end of a lifelong search. Real bass amplification, he calls it. For 6 years, one of the most visible bass players on the planet stood behind a wall of amps built in Molden. Not the old factory, the new one, the one that started in a dining room. Nate Mendel of Foo Fighters adopted the CTM 300 all-valve head, and his account cuts to the practical heart of what Ashdown built. For years I was really frustrated because my band is really loud, drummers loud, guitar players are loud, and in order to try and reach that volume with that much low end, every amp I used would just fall apart, and the Ashdown didn't. Gooday did not try to rebuild Trace Elliot at scale. He had learned the lesson. I want to keep my staff small and never want to return to my staff of hundreds like the days of Trace Elliot. By 2017, Ashdown had about 10 employees making around 55 products out of a 16,000 square foot industrial unit at the old Maltings Hall Road, Heybridge, Maldon, a mile or two from where the old Trace factory stood. He even rented some of the space to other companies to keep the overhead down. Where Trace had chased scale and been swallowed by it, Ashdown stayed small, deliberately, stubbornly, strategically small, and he split the product line in a way he never could have brought himself to do at Trace. The flagship amps, the ABM, the CTM, the signature heads, were designed in Molden and built in Britain. The budget models were manufactured in China. It was the compromise his pride wouldn't allow in the 1990s, the compromise he now names as the lesson that came too late. I should have gone to China or Korea, but my pride in those days wouldn't let me. You don't want to make it there. We're British. I couldn't bring myself to let our wonderful Trace Elliot brand be made offshore, and that was probably one of the things that killed the company. Chapter 12. The Afterlife of Green. What happened to Trace Elliot after January 2002 is a quieter story and a sadder one. For 3 years, Gibson continued to sell Trace Elliot products in reduced quantities, made in the United States. A couple of gold tone-derived combos, a trickle of acoustic amps, some residual bass heads. By 2004, the Trace Elliot page in Gibson's catalogue had shrunk to 2 acoustic models. The brand was a zombie, technically alive, commercially inert. In 2005, the brand passed to PV Electronics of Meridian, Mississippi. The precise mechanism is murky and contested. PV's own press release framed it as North American distribution rights, but Cliff Cooper of Orange Amplifiers, in a 2019 interview, gave a different account. He'd purchased the Trace Elliot brand at a closed tender auction, when it went into liquidation, then promptly sold it on to Peavey at a profit. Gibson liquidated the intellectual property. Cooper bought it cheap. Cooper flipped it to Peavey. The name of one of Britain's most significant bass amp brands changed hands like a second-hand car at auction. Peavey received the name, the trade dress, the green colour and the logo. They did not receive any of the electronic or mechanical designs. The engineering had already left the building, with Clive Button to Ashdown, with Paul Stevens to Orange and then Blackstar, with Clive Roberts, who also briefly moved to Peavey. The brand was refounded with a new engineering team and new products. The most commercially successful Peavey-era Trace Elliot is the LF, a 200-watt Class D micro head weighing under 2 pounds that fits in a gig bag pocket. It is a perfectly competent amplifier. It has nothing to do with the original Maldon amps beyond the name and the colour. The consensus on the bass forums, where such things are debated with the theological seriousness that only musicians bring to equipment, is unsparing. Peavey-era Trace shares zero relationship with the original. A good amp under a ghost name. Trace Elliott's collapse turned out to be an overture to a much louder one. Gibson's consumer electronics acquisitions of 2011 to 2014 went wrong at exactly the scale Ubiquity had bragged about. The Philips deal alone, $135 million plus the brand license, ran into declining consumer electronics margins and pulled trade credit. $500 million of senior secured debt maturing in July 2018. Revenues that had peaked at $2.9 billion in 2015 were cratering. Trade credit insurance providers pulled $100 million in coverage. On the 1st of May 2018, Gibson Brands Incorporated filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in the United States, bankruptcy court for the District of Delaware. Estimated debts up to $500 million. The restructuring plan, approved that October, removed Ushkevich and Berryman from all management responsibilities. Their equity stakes were zeroed out. Ushkevich received a 1-year consulting agreement and warrants for a sliver of the reorganized company. The man who'd wanted to be the Nike of music walked out of the building he'd saved 32 years earlier. Trace Elliot was a footnote in the bankruptcy filing, one dead brand among dozens. But it was the template. Look at the list, and the pattern repeats like a chorus nobody wanted to hear. Tobias Basses, acquired 1990, production moved from California to Nashville with none of the original crew. Michael Tobias departed December 1992 to found MTD, brand slid into budget imports, relaunched only in March 2025 after a 30-year hollow period. Steinberger, acquired 1987, Ned Steinberger prevented from using his own name on new instruments. The innovative headless composites replaced with low-end Asian copies. Opcode Systems, acquired and killed within a year in 1999. Garrison Guitars, acquired 2007. Newfoundland factory closed within months. Kramer, relaunched only in 2020 after years as a budget website brand. The Talkbase consensus, Steinberger, Tobias, Trace Elliot, all withered and died on Gibson's watch. The broader pattern among British amplifier brands tells the same story in different keys. Marshall stayed family-owned until 2023, when it sold to Sweden's Sound Industries, with manufacturing continuing at Milton Keynes. Vox passed to Korg of Japan in 1992 and has been respectfully managed since. Orange survived its own Gibson detour from 1993 to 1997 and was revived by Cliff Cooper. Laney remains family-owned in Hellzauen. Hiwatt bounced through a series of owners after Dave Reeves's death in 1981 and remains contested. HH Electronics, Selma London, Berman, Sound City, WEM, all reduced to brand revivals, boutique continuations, or silence. Among British bass amp makers specifically, Ashdown is the only survivor as an independent, family-run, British-designed operation. The heritage bass brands of 1980 are dead, absorbed, or foreign-owned. A single dining room in Molden in 1997 turned out to be the only path through. Chapter 13. The Head of Doom. The culminating endorsement story closes the circle entirely, and it begins with a bass technician named Terry Welty picking up the phone. Geezer Butler of Black Sabbath had been a Trace Elliot user sporadically through the 1990s. Around 2013 or 2014, Welty approached Ashdown on Butler's behalf. Butler had been using an Ashdown drop-head 30-valve combo at home for years, a small practice amp, the kind of thing you play in the living room when you're not filling arenas. They began developing a signature amplifier. The Head of Doom launched commercially in 2018. 600 watts. Ashdown's marketing also cheerfully quotes 666, because when your artist is the bass player of Black Sabbath, you lean into the mythology. A 12AX7 preamp valve, driving a 9-band EQ, a subharmonic generator, a proprietary Doom overdrive control, twin illuminated VU meters for input and output, the first Ashdown head to carry both, and 3 transformer isolated slave outputs specifically designed so Butler could drive 12 on-stage cabinets without signal degradation. Butler's launch quote frames the entire 47-year arc from Romford to this moment. This combination of amp and preamp is the closest I have found to emulate the old-school sound I had in the 70s. With its punch and clarity, it has the sound of doom I love. And Gooday's replies about his own teenage years, the ones spent playing Sabbath covers with his mate Phil. What a moment for me personally, having grown up playing Sabbath with a band in school and learning all the bass lines with my mate Phil, who could play any guitar lick back after hearing it once. Geezer's sound and tone was part of my bass upbringing and has stayed with me until this very day. A man who grew up playing Geezer Butler's bass lines in a school band in Essex, who became a sheet metal worker, who joined a bass amp company as a metal worker, who became managing director, who was fired, who sold everything he owned, who built amplifiers at his dining room table at 3 a.m. for John Entwistle's birthday. That man, 3 decades later, was building the signature amplifier for the bassist whose sound had started the whole thing. And then, on the 5th of July 2025, at Aston Villa's Villa Park in Birmingham, 50,000 people watched Black Sabbath play their final concert. Back to the beginning, the farewell show for Ozzy Osbourne. Behind Geezer, Butler stood a wall of sound that Ashdown had built in Molden, custom COD2128 and COD2158 cabinets, 300 watts each, custom metal grills carrying Butler's own artwork, driven by Head of Doom amplifiers. The bass sound that rolled across Villa Park that evening had been designed in a 16,000-square-foot unit on the Blackwater estuary by a company of 10 people in a town that makes salt. 15 of those rehearsal-used Head of Doom amps, each hand-signed by Butler in silver marker on the control panel with a certificate signed by Dan Gooday. Mark's son, the boy who'd wandered past burn-in racks in the old factory, now running the company his father built from nothing, were subsequently sold through Reverb. A father and a son, 2 factories, a mile apart, 47 years. The British industrial story is usually told as a story of decline. A factory opens, it prospers, capital arrives from somewhere else, the work moves, the gates close, the silence that follows has a physical weight. This one, for once, is told differently. The green glow went off on a Tuesday in January 2002, when 44 people walked out of a shed on the Blackwater trading estate for the last time. The machines stopped. The burn-in racks went dark. The wave soldering bath cooled. The smell of flux and Tolex and freshly cut MDF faded from the building. And within a few years, someone else was making someone else's amplifiers in the same space. And the only people who remembered what the green light had meant were the bass players who'd stood behind it in the dark. But a mile up the road, in a smaller building, with fewer people, the VU meter stayed lit. It's still lit. A needle shivering to the beat in an amplifier built by hand in Maldon, Essex, by a family that refused to stop making things. Not through one catastrophe, not through a single act of corporate malice, through a helicopter company's cancelled distribution plan, and a man's pride in British manufacturing that he couldn't let go of until it was too late, and a Nashville empire that grew past the point where anyone at the top could see the small factory on the estuary that was quietly going dark. 3 reasonable decisions, each one moving the work a little further from the hands that knew how to do it, until the green glow went off and the only light left was the VU meter, blue, warm, still moving, in a shed a mile away.